The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the military courtroom like angry wasps trapped in glass. Colonel Evelyn Reaper Maddox sat ramrod straight in the witness chair, her weathered hands folded precisely in her lap, watching as Judge Advocate General Marcus Thornfield shuffled through papers with theatrical disdain. The man had made his reputation destroying military careers with surgical precision, and today's target wore dress blues that couldn't quite hide the network of scars running along her left arm, souvenirs from a war most people preferred to forget. Colonel Maddox, Thornfield's voice carried the particular brand of condescension reserved for those he deemed beneath his Harvard law pedigree. Your service record shows an alarming pattern of insubordination and reckless behavior. Multiple instances of unauthorized tactical decisions, violation of engagement protocols, and, he paused for effect, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, an apparent inability to follow direct orders from superior officers. The gallery was packed with junior officers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed anticipation. Word had spread through the base like wildfire. The legendary pilot everyone called Reaper was finally facing a court-martial that could strip her of rank, pension, and the Distinguished Service Cross that sat heavy on her chest. Some whispered she was past her prime, a relic from conflicts that didn't matter anymore. Others remembered stories their instructors told in hushed reverence, but those seemed like myths now. Watching this small woman with graying temples and laugh lines etched deep around steel-blue eyes. Thornfield stood, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum with metronomic precision. In my 15 years presiding over military justice, I've seen many officers attempt to justify their failures through appeals to emotion or claims of heroism. But the law is clear, Colonel. Discipline forms the backbone of our armed forces. Without it, he gestured broadly, we have chaos. Reaper's expression never changed. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, even as the judge's words painted her as everything wrong with modern military leadership. Behind her, she could feel the weight of stares from pilots she had trained, officers whose lives she had saved, and bureaucrats who saw her as an inconvenient reminder of wars fought in shadows and deserts far from Washington's marble corridors. The prosecution alleges, Thornfield continued, warming to his theme, that your actions during Operation Sandstorm directly violated rules of engagement, endangered civilian lives, and demonstrated a fundamental lack of judgment that renders you unfit for continued service. His smile was razor-thin. What do you say to these charges, Colonel? The courtroom fell silent except for the persistent hum of fluorescent lights and the whisper of air conditioning. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for her response. Reaper finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious more times than anyone cared to count. Your Honor, before I answer those charges, I believe you should know exactly who you're speaking to. Something in her tone made Thornfield pause mid-gesture, his confident smirk faltering slightly. I beg your pardon. My call sign, Your Honor. I don't think you understand what it means. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. In the gallery, several older officers straightened unconsciously, recognition dawning in their eyes. A few reached instinctively for phones, suddenly understanding they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. The younger pilots looked confused, but the veterans, the ones who had served in the deepest parts of conflicts that never made the evening news, began to sit forward with expressions of dawning comprehension. Thornfield's voice carried a note of irritation mixed with uncertainty. Colonel, your call sign is a matter of record. I hardly see how. Reaper 6-7, she said quietly, and the words hit the courtroom like a physical force. Mosul, Fallujah, the Helmand Province, Kandahar, 37 confirmed air-to-air kills, 49 close air support missions where not a single friendly was lost, 216 pilots trained under my command, 194 of whom are alive today because of what I taught them. The color was beginning to drain from Thornfield's face, but Reaper wasn't finished. Her voice remained steady, conversational even, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a legacy written in blood and fire across 3 different theaters of war. The Battle of Al Asad Air Base, February 15, 2019. Perhaps you remember reading about it in your briefings, Your Honor. 48 hours of continuous enemy bombardment. 7 F-16s destroyed on the ground. Runway cratered beyond use. No possibility of reinforcement or resupply. She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes never leaving his. 6 pilots managed to get airborne in damaged aircraft. I was one of them. A whisper ran through the gallery like wind through tall grass. Some of the older officers were nodding now, recognition flooding their faces. The Battle of Al Asad had been classified for years, but stories leaked, as stories always do in military circles. Stories of impossible odds and miraculous victories, of pilots who flew damaged planes on fumes and prayer, while enemy fighters swarmed the sky like angry hornets. We were outnumbered 8-1, Reaper continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a particularly vivid dream. My wingman, Captain Rodriguez, took shrapnel through his canopy in the first engagement, lost hydraulics. I could hear him bleeding over the radio, fighting to stay conscious. The tactical manual says to disengage when facing overwhelming odds, fall back to a defensible position, wait for reinforcement. She smiled then, an expression devoid of humor but rich with memory. I've never been particularly good at following the manual. Thornfield tried to reassert control, his voice cracking slightly. Colonel, while your service record is commendable, it doesn't excuse violations of current protocols. The law applies equally to all service members, regardless of past achievements. The word commendable hung in the air like an insult. Several officers in the gallery exchanged glances that could have melted steel. Commendable, as if preventing the complete annihilation of an American airbase was merely noteworthy rather than the stuff of legend. Reaper's smile widened slightly, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked genuinely amused. Your Honor, I haven't even gotten to the interesting part yet. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell sat in the 3rd row, her notebook forgotten in her lap. She had been assigned to observe the proceedings for her dissertation on military justice, but now she found herself holding her breath along with everyone else. Mitchell was old enough to remember the stories that circulated through flight school, whispered legends about a pilot who had single-handedly changed the course of several major engagements. She had always assumed they were exaggerated, the way all war stories grow in the telling. Now, watching Reaper speak with calm precision about events that most people would never have the security clearance to hear about, Mitchell began to understand that the stories might have been understatements. The enemy had established air superiority, Reaper continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Their MiGs were flying combat air patrols at 15,000 feet, effectively sealing off the entire sector. Standard doctrine calls for defensive positions and radio silence until friendly forces can establish a numerical advantage. But Rodriguez was losing blood fast, and there were 3,000 Marines on that base who weren't going to last until morning if someone didn't do something about those enemy aircraft. She paused, her gaze moving across the faces in the gallery before settling back on Thornfield. So I made a decision. Not according to the manual, Your Honor, not according to protocol. I made the kind of decision that gets people killed, or saves them. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Even the air conditioning seemed to have fallen quiet, as if the building itself was leaning in to listen. Thornfield's hands gripped the edge of his podium, knuckles white, clearly beginning to understand that he had wandered into territory far beyond his expertise. I took my flight vertical, Reaper said simply. Straight up through their combat air patrol. 4 F-16s against 23 enemy fighters. The manual says that's suicide. The manual says a lot of things about acceptable losses and strategic withdrawal. The manual wasn't written by someone watching Marines die while politicians argue about rules of engagement 3,000 miles away. Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, each syllable dropped into the silence like stones into still water. This wasn't bravado or theatrics. This was someone stating facts with the same inflection she might use to report the weather. What happened next would be classified above your clearance level, Your Honor, but I can tell you this. When the sun rose the next morning, every Marine on that base was alive. Every single one. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. Rodriguez made it home to his daughter's quinceañera. He sends me pictures every year. The courtroom erupted in a buzz of whispered conversations. Several officers were frantically typing on their phones, pulling up classified reports they suddenly had new context for. Others sat in stunned silence, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Judge Thornfield hammered his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. Order, order in this courtroom. When the noise subsided, he fixed Reaper with a withering stare. Colonel, while your war stories may impress some people, they don't change the fact that you violated direct orders during Operation Sandstorm. 47 civilians were killed in that engagement because you chose to ignore established protocols. The accusation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. The whispering stopped instantly, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost visible. This was the heart of the case, the reason why a living legend was sitting in a witness chair facing potential disgrace. For the first time since taking the stand, Reaper's composure flickered. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her hands, still folded in her lap, clenched slightly before relaxing again. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of something dangerous, like distant thunder promising a storm. 47 civilians, she repeated slowly. Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware of the count. I'm also aware that 312 others lived because of the choices I made that day. But I don't expect you to understand the mathematics of war from behind a desk in Washington. Thornfield's face went crimson. Colonel Maddox, you will address this court with respect, or I'll hold you in contempt. Respect, Reaper mused, as if tasting the word. Yes, let's talk about respect, Your Honor. Let's talk about the respect due to pilots who volunteer to fly into contested airspace while lawyers argue about liability. Let's talk about the respect due to ground forces who call for air support knowing that help might not come because someone with a law degree is worried about paperwork. She stood slowly, her medals catching the fluorescent light. The simple action somehow transformed the entire dynamic of the room. She was no longer a defendant. She was a force of nature barely contained by military protocol. Operation Sandstorm. You want to know what really happened? Fine. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I'll tell you exactly what happened, Your Honor, and when I'm finished, you'll understand why 47 deaths haunt my dreams, and why 312 people get to tuck their children into bed tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped their persistent buzzing. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the small woman in dress blues whose very presence had somehow shifted the balance of power in the room. Thornfield opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently recognizing that he had awakened something far beyond his ability to control. In the gallery, phones buzzed silently as words spread through the Pentagon's corridors. Reaper was talking, really talking, about classified operations, about decisions made in the heat of battle, about the price of leadership when every choice carries a body count. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell found herself gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had gone white. This wasn't a court-martial anymore. This was history unfolding in real time, the kind of testimony that would be studied in war colleges for generations. She had the sudden, overwhelming sense that she was witnessing something that would define military doctrine for years to come. Syria, March 21st, Reaper began, her voice carrying the weight of memory and pain in equal measure. 3 villages along the Euphrates River. Intelligence reported a terrorist cell had taken hostages, teachers, aid workers, children from a school that had been built by American engineers 6 months earlier. The kind of target that makes headlines if it goes wrong. She began to pace, her movements precise and economical like a caged predator finding its rhythm. Command authorized a surgical strike. Rules of engagement were clear. Positive identification required before weapons release. No collateral damage acceptable. Clean in, clean out, bring the hostages home alive. Thornfield tried to interrupt, but Reaper's voice cut through his objection like a blade through silk. I had 4 F-18 Super Hornets under my command, 12 hours of prep time. Satellite imagery updated every 15 minutes. The intelligence package was perfect, too perfect as it turned out. The courtroom held its collective breath as she continued. We went in at dawn, using the sun as cover, radio chatter minimal, target acquisition systems locked and loaded, everything by the book, Your Honor, everything according to protocol. Her laugh was bitter, devoid of any warmth. The book doesn't account for children playing in a courtyard that wasn't supposed to exist. The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. Several officers looked down at their hands, recognizing the particular kind of hell she was describing. The moment when perfect intelligence meets imperfect reality, when split-second decisions carry consequences that last forever. The hostages were there, she continued, her voice steady despite the subject matter. Exactly where intelligence said they would be. But so were 47 civilians who had no business being within 5 miles of an active combat zone. Families fleeing the fighting in Aleppo. Refugees who had chosen the wrong village to shelter in because it looked peaceful from the outside. Reaper stopped packing and faced Thornfield directly, her blue eyes blazing with controlled intensity. I had 12 seconds to make a choice, Your Honor. 12 seconds between target acquisition and weapons release. I could abort the mission, watch the terrorists execute every hostage, and explain to Congress why American citizens died because we were too worried about civilian casualties. Or I could take the shot, save the hostages, and live with the knowledge that 47 innocent people paid the price for my decision. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Thornfield's confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the growing realization that he was dealing with complexities far beyond the scope of military law. In the gallery, seasoned combat veterans nodded with grim understanding, recognizing a dilemma that haunted every warrior who had ever served in an asymmetric conflict. What did you do? The question came from Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had spoken without conscious thought, caught up in the terrible momentum of Reaper's testimony. Reaper turned toward her, and for a moment her expression softened with something approaching gratitude. I followed my training, Lieutenant Colonel, not the manual, my training. The kind that comes from watching good people die because someone in a comfortable office made the safe choice. I took the shot. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some officers shouted in approval, others in horror. Thornfield hammered his gavel repeatedly, his face a mask of fury and confusion. But through the noise, Reaper's voice carried clear and strong, cutting through the tumult like a ship's horn through fog. Every terrorist in that compound died in under 30 seconds. 12 hostages walked out alive. 47 civilians didn't. And I've carried their names with me every day since, because that's what command means, Your Honor. That's what responsibility looks like when it's not just theoretical. As order slowly returned to the courtroom, the transformation was complete. Reaper was no longer the defendant in this proceeding. She was the teacher, and everyone else, including Judge Thornfield, was learning lessons they had never expected to face. The weight of revelation hung heavy in the recycled air. Thornfield had gone pale. his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that he was presiding over something far more complex than a simple case of military insubordination. His law degree from Harvard, his 15 years of military justice experience, his carefully cultivated reputation, none of it had prepared him for this moment when theoretical legal principles collided with the brutal reality of command decisions made under fire. "Colonel Maddox," he said finally, his voice notably less authoritative than before, "while the tragedy of civilian casualties in any military operation is regrettable, you still acted outside your authorized parameters. The law doesn't provide exceptions based on personal judgment, regardless of the outcome." Reaper smiled then, and the expression was more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. It was the smile of someone who had faced down death repeatedly and found it wanting, someone who understood that real courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. "Personal judgment," she repeated slowly. "Yes, let's examine that concept, Your Honor, because everything I've told you so far happened exactly according to the after-action reports. Everything I've described was reviewed, analyzed, and ultimately approved by the Pentagon's finest strategic minds. Operation Sandstorm was classified as a tactical success with acceptable losses." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "But there's something those reports don't mention. Something that happened 37 minutes after the primary strike, when my aircraft were already headed home and the mission was officially complete." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Several officers in the gallery exchanged worried glances, recognizing the particular tone that preceded revelations nobody wanted to hear. "Radio intercept picked up enemy communications," Reaper continued, her voice taking on the mechanical precision of an official briefing. "3 more terrorist cells were converging on the village, not the one we had just hit, a different village, 2 kilometers east. Same valley, but completely separate from our area of operations. Intelligence had missed it entirely." Thornfield leaned forward despite himself, caught up in the narrative despite his legal training telling him to maintain professional distance. What was the tactical significance? 400 civilians, Reaper said simply. Mostly women and children who had fled there seeking shelter from the fighting. No military value whatsoever, but the terrorists didn't care. They had lost their command structure in our strike, and they were looking for revenge. The intercepted communications were clear. They intended to massacre everyone in the village as retaliation for the American raid. The implications hit the courtroom like a physical wave. This wasn't about the operation they knew had happened. This was about a second crisis that had apparently unfolded in real time, forcing split-second decisions with no guidance from command authority thousands of miles away. "My fuel reserves were at minimum safe levels for the return flight," Reaper continued. "Radio contact with base command was intermittent due to atmospheric conditions. Standard operating procedure in such circumstances is clear. Return to base, file a complete debrief, let intelligence assets on the ground handle emerging situations through proper channels." She began packing again, her movements sharp and controlled. "But radio intercepts don't lie, Your Honor, and neither do satellite feeds showing 3 columns of armed vehicles converging on a defenseless village. I had maybe 15 minutes before those terrorists reached their target. 15 minutes to decide whether 400 innocent people lived or died." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell realized she was holding her breath, along with everyone else in the courtroom. This was the moment of decision that would define not just Reaper's career, but the entire moral framework around military command authority. The kind of situation that military theorists debated in academic settings, but rarely faced in the harsh light of operational reality. "I made a choice," Reaper said quietly. "Not according to protocol, not with proper authorization, not with backup or support or any guarantee that I would survive what came next. I turned my aircraft around and engaged 3 separate enemy formations without orders, without reinforcement, and without enough fuel to guarantee I could make it home afterward. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines from the base outside. Everyone in the courtroom understood that they were hearing about a decision that existed in the gray area between heroism and insubordination, where individual conscience collided with institutional authority. Thornfield's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happened?" "I stopped them," Reaper said simply. "All 3 columns, 46 enemy casualties, 0 civilian deaths, but it cost me my last reserves of fuel and ammunition. Had to put down in a contested landing zone with a damaged aircraft and wait 18 hours for extraction while enemy forces closed in around my position." She turned to face the gallery, her blue eyes moving across the faces of officers who had served in similar circumstances, who understood the weight of command decisions made in isolation and desperation. "That's the violation of protocol you're prosecuting, Your Honor. Not the authorized mission that saved 12 hostages, the unauthorized one that saved 400 civilians." The revelation recontextualized everything. What had seemed like reckless insubordination moments before now appeared as something else entirely. A decision made by someone whose moral compass pointed toward the preservation of innocent life, regardless of personal cost or institutional approval. Thornfield struggled to maintain his composure, clearly realizing that his carefully prepared case had just collapsed around him. "Colonel, even if your intentions were admirable, military discipline requires adherence to chain of command. Soldiers cannot be permitted to act unilaterally, regardless of circumstances." "Soldiers," Reaper repeated, and her tone carried decades of frustration with bureaucratic limitations. "Yes, soldiers must follow orders, but leaders, Your Honor, real leaders, sometimes have to make choices that can't wait for committee approval. Sometimes you have to choose between following rules and following conscience." She moved to stand directly in front of the judge's bench, her small frame somehow dominating the entire courtroom through sheer force of presence. "You want to strip me of rank and pension because I chose to save lives instead of following protocol. That's your prerogative. But before you make that decision, I want you to understand exactly who you're punishing." The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Mitchell's pen dropping to the floor seemed loud as a gunshot. Every person present understood that they were witnessing history, not just a court-martial, but a defining moment in the ongoing tension between individual conscience and institutional authority that had shaped military doctrine since armies first marched in formation. "Reaper 6-7, she said again, and this time the call sign carried different weight. Not just identification, but legacy. 96 combat missions over 3 theaters of war, 743 enemy combatants neutralized, 4,217 friendly forces successfully supported through close air operations, 0 friendly fire incidents, 0 civilian casualties in authorized operations." She paused, letting the statistics sink in before continuing. "But those numbers don't tell the real story, Your Honor. The real story is in the letters I receive every Christmas from pilots whose lives I saved by teaching them to fly beyond the manual. The real story is in the wedding invitations from Marines who walked out of impossible situations because someone decided that rules serve people, not the other way around." Reaper reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph. She placed it on Thornfield's bench with reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. "That's Captain Rodriguez's daughter, Maria. She graduated from MIT last month with a degree in aerospace engineering. She wants to design aircraft that will keep pilots safer in combat zones." The image showed a young woman in a cap and gown, beaming with pride as she stood between her parents. Rodriguez was older now, grayer, but his smile was radiant as he looked at his daughter, the daughter he had lived to see grow up, because someone had chosen to ignore protocol in favor of human life. Rodriguez was unconscious for the last 20 minutes of that engagement at Al Assad, Reaper continued, her voice soft with memory. Lost too much blood, too much oxygen. Standard procedure says to abandon aircraft that can't maintain formation. Leave damaged pilots to crash in the desert while the rest of the flight preserves itself for future missions. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Officers who had served in similar circumstances felt the weight of recognition, understanding that they were hearing about the kind of moral choice that defined character in ways no peacetime exercise could replicate. I used my aircraft to guide his damaged F-16 home. 23 minutes of formation flying with an unconscious pilot, enemy fighters still in the area, and fuel gauges reading empty. The manual says that's impossible. The manual says a lot of things that don't account for what people can accomplish when other people's lives depend on it. Thornfield stared at the photograph. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The legal framework that had seemed so solid an hour ago now felt inadequate to address the complexity of what he was hearing. Military law was designed to handle clear-cut cases of discipline and order, not moral philosophy played out at 30,000 feet with live ammunition. Your Honor, Reaper said quietly, I've spent 23 years in service to this country. I've made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost lives. Some of them were authorized by proper channels, others weren't. But every single one was made with the understanding that my primary mission isn't to follow orders, it's to bring people home alive. She retrieved the photograph and returned it to her pocket with care. If that makes me guilty of insubordination, then I accept that verdict. But I won't apologize for choosing to save 400 innocent lives, and I won't pretend that military discipline is more important than human conscience. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Even the air conditioning seemed to have fallen quiet, as if the building itself was processing the weight of what had been spoken. This was no longer a legal proceeding in any conventional sense. It had become something closer to a moral reckoning, a moment when institutional authority confronted individual responsibility and found itself wanting. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell realized she was witnessing something that would be studied in military academies for decades to come, not just for the tactical decisions involved, but for the ethical framework that had guided them. This was leadership distilled to its essential elements, the willingness to accept personal consequences for choices made on behalf of others. Thornfield cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier authority. Colonel Maddox, this court will need to recess to consider the full implications of your testimony. No, Your Honor. Reaper's response was immediate and firm. With respect, this court will not recess because you haven't heard the most important part of my testimony yet. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Thornfield's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, clearly struggling to reassert control over proceedings that had spiraled far beyond his experience or training. In the gallery, officers leaned forward with expressions of fascination and growing alarm, recognizing that they were approaching some kind of crucial revelation. Colonel, Thornfield managed finally, you have already provided extensive testimony regarding your unconventional interpretation of military protocols. What more could possibly be relevant to these proceedings? Reaper smiled again, and this time the expression carried genuine warmth mixed with something that might have been pity. Your Honor, everything I've told you so far happened years ago, ancient history in military terms. But what you don't understand is that the same choice, the choice between protocol and conscience, isn't historical. It's happening right now. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Several officers reached for their phones, suddenly wondering if there were current operations they weren't aware of, classified missions unfolding in real time while they sat in a sterile courtroom arguing about past decisions. Operation Ghost Hawk, Reaper said quietly, and the murmurs died instantly. Launched 6 hours ago, classified above most of your security levels but not above mine. She looked directly at Thornfield, whose face had gone ashen. 3 American pilots are currently engaged in a rescue operation in hostile territory. No backup, no support, no guarantee they'll make it home alive. The implication hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't just about past decisions anymore. It was about ongoing operations, about American lives currently at risk while bureaucrats debated the finer points of military discipline. The mission commander for Ghost Hawk, Reaper continued, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, is Captain Jennifer Phoenix Walsh. She graduated from my advanced combat training program 18 months ago. Everything she knows about survival in contested airspace, she learned from me. Thornfield's voice cracked slightly. Colonel, if there's an active operation. There's always an active operation, Your Honor. Reaper's interruption was sharp as a blade. There are always American lives hanging in the balance while people in comfortable offices debate whether saving them is worth the paperwork complications. That's the reality of military service that your law books don't address. She moved closer to the bench, her presence somehow filling the entire courtroom despite her modest stature. Captain Walsh is flying the same kind of mission I flew in Syria. Same impossible odds, same split-second decisions, same choice between following orders and following conscience. And right now, while you're deciding whether to punish me for making that choice, she's making it herself. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker of tension and uncertainty. Officers who had been following the proceedings as entertainment were suddenly confronted with the realization that people they knew, pilots they had trained with, were currently in harm's way while their community sat in judgment of the very principles that might save them. 6 hours ago, Reaper continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of an operational briefing, intelligence assets detected a terrorist cell holding 4 American contractors in a compound near Mosul. Standard hostage rescue protocols were initiated. Delta Force was tasked with ground assault, Navy SEALs were positioned for maritime extraction, and Air Force assets were assigned close air support. She paused, her blue eyes scanning the faces in the gallery before settling back on Thornfield. But intelligence was wrong. Again, the compound was a decoy. The real target was 12 kilometers north, in a location that wasn't supposed to exist according to our satellite imagery. The parallel to Operation Sandstorm was obvious and chilling. History repeating itself in real time, with American lives hanging in the balance while established protocols proved inadequate to address evolving circumstances. Captain Walsh discovered the deception through intercepted radio communications. She had a choice: follow her authorized flight plan and watch 4 Americans die, or violate her orders and attempt a rescue operation she wasn't equipped or authorized to perform. Thornfield leaned forward despite himself, completely caught up in the narrative. What did she do? She did what I trained her to do, Reaper said simply. She chose to save lives instead of follow protocol. Right now, at this very moment, she's engaged in an unauthorized rescue operation that violates every rule of engagement you've cited in this proceeding. The weight of revelation settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Every officer present understood the implications. While they sat debating past decisions, current events were making those debates irrelevant. The choice between protocol and conscience wasn't theoretical. It was being played out in real time by pilots who had learned their moral framework from the woman currently facing court-martial for teaching it. If Captain Walsh succeeds, Reaper continued, 4 Americans will come home alive, and your case against me becomes a prosecution of the very principles that saved them. If she fails, 4 Americans will die, and their blood will be on the hands of everyone who insisted that following orders is more important than following conscience. The silence that followed was deafening. Thornfield stared at his notes as if they might provide guidance for a situation no legal training had prepared him to handle. In the gallery, career officers grappled with the realization that their entire profession rested on a foundation of moral choices that couldn't be reduced to simple questions of legal compliance. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell found herself thinking about her own service record, about the times she had followed orders without question, and the times she had chosen to interpret them creatively. Every military officer faced the same fundamental tension Reaper was describing: the balance between institutional authority and individual conscience, between safety and duty, between following rules and doing what was right. "Your Honor," Reaper said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "you have a choice to make. You can punish me for teaching pilots to value human life above bureaucratic convenience, knowing that those same lessons might be saving American lives at this very moment. Or you can recognize that real leadership sometimes requires the courage to make hard choices without permission." She straightened her shoulders, her medals catching the fluorescent light one final time. "But whatever you decide, understand this. There are pilots flying dangerous missions right now who are alive because someone taught them that moral courage matters more than career advancement. That's my legacy, Your Honor. That's what you're really prosecuting here." The courtroom held its collective breath as Thornfield struggled with a decision that transcended legal precedent and entered the realm of moral philosophy. Everyone present understood that this moment would define not just Reaper's fate, but the entire culture of military leadership for years to come. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like electronic insects, their harsh glare illuminating a scene that had transformed from a routine court-martial into something approaching legend. Judge Advocate General Marcus Thornfield sat behind his bench, staring at notes that had become irrelevant, while Colonel Evelyn Reaper Maddox stood before him like an embodiment of everything complex and contradictory about military service. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken finally by the soft chirp of a secure communication device somewhere in the gallery. Several officers reached for their phones simultaneously, but protocol demanded they remain silent during proceedings. The sound, however, carried obvious implications. Operation Ghost Hawk was still unfolding, and the choices being debated in this courtroom were playing out in real time at 30,000 feet above hostile territory. Thornfield cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the commanding authority that had marked the beginning of these proceedings. "Colonel Maddox, this court. I must admit, this court finds itself in unprecedented territory." "Yes, Your Honor," Reaper replied quietly. "That's what happens when legal theory meets operational reality. The neat boundaries drawn by lawyers and politicians tend to blur when people start shooting at you." Several officers in the gallery nodded unconsciously, recognizing the truth of that observation from their own combat experience. The gap between classroom theory and battlefield practice was something every warrior understood.